A woman named Linda appeared in my father's life 8 months before he died. I want to tell you about Linda carefully, because the story of what Linda did requires that you understand exactly how she did it. Not because I want to give anyone a blueprint, but because the way it worked, the patience of it, the precision of it, the way it exploited everything that made my father a good and trusting man, is something I think people need to know about. My father's name was George. George was 79 years old when Linda arrived. He was a retired engineer who had spent 40 years solving problems with methodical precision and who, in his retirement, had applied that same precision to his garden, his woodworking, and the crossword puzzle he did every morning without fail. He was sharp. He was independent. He was, by every measure, in full possession of his faculties. He was also lonely. My mother Eleanor had died 3 years earlier, after 51 years of marriage. George had handled Eleanor's death with the same quiet steadiness he brought to everything. He grieved, he continued, he did not collapse. But the house was very large for one person. The evenings were very long. And Linda understood this immediately. This is the story of what happened next. And of what my brother Nathan and I did about it. Chapter 1, The Beginning. I need to tell you who George was before Linda, because it matters to everything that follows. George grew up during a time when you trusted people. When a handshake meant something. When the idea that someone might befriend you specifically to take something from you would have seemed not just unlikely but almost incomprehensible. He was generous in the particular way of people who have never had reason to be suspicious. He helped neighbors without being asked. He remembered people's names and their children's names and what they were going through. He believed, fundamentally, that most people were decent. I am his daughter. My name is Diane. I am 53 years old and I live 40 minutes from the house where I grew up, the house where George continued to live after my mother Eleanor died. My brother Nathan is 56 and lives 2 hours away. We called George every few days. We visited on weekends when we could. We worried about him, the way adult children worry about a widowed parent, the particular anxiety of knowing someone is alone in a house that used to be full. George told us not to worry. He said he was fine. He had his garden and his woodworking and his crossword puzzles. He had the neighbors, though most of them were younger and busy with their own lives. He had us when we visited. He was fine, he said. And then he mentioned Linda. She had introduced herself in the supermarket, he said. She had noticed he was buying food for one and they had gotten to talking. She was recently widowed herself. She was about his age. She was, he said, very pleasant. I said, "That's nice, Dad." I did not think anything of it. That was my first mistake. Chapter 2, The Betrayal. Linda's campaign, and I am going to call it what it was, even though that word sounds dramatic, because it was in fact a campaign, conducted with patience and strategy over 8 months, began exactly the way these things always begin. With kindness. Linda started calling George. Just to chat, she said. Just to check in. She remembered everything he told her and asked about it the next time they spoke. She brought him food, casseroles, baked goods, the particular language of care that speaks directly to people who live alone and eat their meals in silence. She came to his house. She helped him with small things. She drove him to appointments when he mentioned that driving at night had become difficult. She sat with him in the evenings and watched television and talked about their late spouses and their lives. George, who had been lonely for 3 years, was grateful. And Nathan and I, watching from a distance, were cautiously pleased. George seemed happier. He had company. He had someone who paid attention to him. We met Linda at Easter dinner. She was warm, well-presented, asked intelligent questions. She seemed genuinely fond of George in a way that appeared natural. I noticed that she was perhaps 10 years younger than she had implied, closer to 65 than 70. I noticed that she seemed to know a great deal about George's finances, things that had come up in conversation, she said, naturally. I noticed these things and I filed them away without acting on them. That was my second mistake. The change in George's will happen in month 7. We did not know about it until after he died. George's original will, which Eleanor and he had made together 20 years earlier and updated after Eleanor's death, left everything equally to Nathan and me. The house, the savings, the investments, everything divided evenly between his 2 children. The new will left the house to Linda. And a sum of money to Linda. And the remainder, what was left after Linda's inheritance, to Nathan and me. Linda's share was not small. We found this out sitting in a lawyer's office 3 weeks after George's funeral. A lawyer named Stephen Marsh, who had not been George's lawyer for the original will. A new lawyer, recommended to George by Linda, who Linda had driven him to see. I looked at Nathan across that office. And I understood, in that moment, that I had been watching something happen for 8 months and had not allowed myself to see it clearly. Chapter 3, The Decision. I want to be honest about what I felt in the days after Stephen Marsh's office. Grief, obviously. I was still in the acute phase of losing my father and the grief was real and enormous and independent of everything else. But underneath the grief, something colder. Rage, partly. But rage was not useful. Rage wanted me to call Linda and say things that would have felt satisfying for approximately 4 minutes and then complicated everything for months. I did not call Linda. I called Nathan. Nathan was, predictably, furious. Nathan wanted to contest the will immediately, loudly, with maximum force. Nathan wanted lawyers and court dates and public confrontation. I said, Nathan. Stop. We need to think before we act. Nathan said, what is there to think about? She manipulated Dad into changing his will. I said, I know. But knowing it and proving it are different things. And if we go in too fast, without the right evidence, we lose. Nathan was quiet for a moment. He said, what do you suggest? I said, I want to find out if Linda has done this before. Because here was the thing that was sitting in my mind, the thing I kept returning to. The precision of it. Linda had not made a single obvious mistake. She had been kind for 8 months before the will changed. She had used a new lawyer, someone with no existing relationship with George who could not compare the new will to the old one and raise questions. She had driven George to the appointments herself. She had been present, always present, in a way that controlled the information George received. This was not someone acting impulsively out of affection. This was someone who knew exactly what they were doing. And people who know exactly what they are doing have usually done it before. I hired a private investigator named Michael Chen. I told Michael exactly what I suspected and what I needed. I needed to know who Linda was before she appeared in my father's supermarket. I needed to know if there were other widowers in her past. I needed to know her real name, her real age, her real history. Michael said he would call me in 2 weeks. He called me in 10 days. Chapter 4, The Evidence. What Michael found changed everything. Linda's real name was not Linda. It was Marlene. She had used several names over the years, always with the same first initial, always in the same general style, ordinary, forgettable, the kind of name that does not stick in the memory. Marlene was 63 years old. She was not recently widowed. She had never been married, as far as Michael could determine. She had, however, had a series of relationships with elderly widowers in 3 different states over the previous 12 years. Michael had found 2 of them. The first was a man named Harold, 77 at the time, whose daughter had contested a will change that occurred 8 months into Marlene's relationship with him. The contest had been settled quietly, out of court. The daughter, a woman named Susan, had signed a non-disclosure agreement as part of the settlement. The second was a man named Frank, 81, who had died in another state 4 years ago. Frank's son David had noticed significant withdrawals from Frank's accounts in the 6 months before his death. David had contacted Adult Protective Services. An investigation had been opened. And then, Michael was not sure exactly what had happened. It had been closed without charges. I called Susan first. Susan, whose father Harold had been targeted 8 years earlier, was not able to speak about the specifics because of the NDA she had signed. But she told me something that did not violate her agreement. She said, "I cannot tell you about my case. But I can tell you to be very careful, very organized, and very patient. And I can tell you that you should talk to David." David, Frank's son, was not under any NDA. David had been waiting for 3 years for someone else to find what he had found. David had documentation. Financial records showing a pattern of transfers from Frank's accounts during the period of Marlene's involvement. A timeline showing the relationship between Marlene's presence and the depletion of Frank's savings. Photographs. Records of the Adult Protective Services investigation. David and I spoke for 2 hours. By the end of that conversation, I had the outline of a pattern. 3 men. 3 states. 3 sets of circumstances that followed the same structure: lonely widower, patient befriending, growing financial involvement, changed documents, death, contested estate. And one woman at the center of all of it, moving from state to state, name to name, leaving behind families who had been told to be quiet or had not known enough to fight. I brought all of it to a lawyer named Catherine Webb who specialized in elder financial abuse. Catherine read through everything carefully. Then she looked up and said, "This is the most well-documented case of serial elder financial abuse I have seen in 15 years of practice. The question is whether it is enough." I said, "What do we need?" She said, "More. We need to establish a pattern that is undeniable. David's documentation is strong, but it is in another state and the case was never prosecuted. Susan is under NDA. We need something specific to your father's case that shows Marlene knew what she was doing and did it deliberately." I said, "How do we get that?" Catherine said, "We look at the new will very carefully. And we look at the circumstances under which it was signed." Chapter 5, The Justice. What Catherine found when she examined the new will was a problem. Not with the document itself. The document was technically correct. George's signature was genuine. Stephen Marsh, the lawyer Linda had recommended, had followed proper procedure. The problem was the timing. George had visited Stephen Marsh's office 3 times over 4 weeks to execute the new will. On each of those 3 occasions, the records showed that Linda had driven him to the appointment and waited in the reception area. On the 3rd occasion, the final signing, Linda had been present in the office. Stephen Marsh had allowed the primary beneficiary of the will to be present during its execution. This was not illegal. But it was, Catherine said, deeply irregular. And it was the kind of irregularity that, combined with everything else, told a story. Catherine subpoenaed George's medical records from the period. She found notes from his doctor, his regular doctor, not any physician Linda had introduced, observing that George had seemed unusually influenced by a new companion and had deferred to her on several occasions during appointments in a manner inconsistent with his usual independence. The doctor had not acted on this observation. But she had written it down. Catherine contacted Adult Protective Services in the state where David's case had been investigated. The investigator who had handled Frank's case was still employed there. The investigation had been closed, she told us, because of insufficient evidence at the time. But the file was still open. And the pattern we had now documented, 3 states, 3 victims, the same methodology, was the kind of evidence that could reopen it. It reopened it. The criminal investigation that followed was not quick. These things rarely are. But it was thorough, and it had the advantage of something that each individual case had lacked: the full picture. Marlene was charged in connection with Frank's case, where the financial evidence was strongest and where David's documentation made prosecution viable. She was also charged with fraud in connection with George's estate. The charges in George's case led to a civil settlement. Linda, Marlene, agreed to relinquish the bequest George had left her. All of it. The house remained in the family. The money returned to where George had intended it to go. Marlene did not go to prison. I want to be honest about that. The criminal case in Frank's state resulted in a plea agreement that included probation and a fine rather than incarceration. The system that was supposed to protect people like George and Frank and Harold was not perfect. But she was stopped. She was documented. She was known. The pattern was on the record in a way that would follow her wherever she went next. I think about George sometimes and the 8 months he spent with Linda. I try to hold on to the fact that he was not foolish. He was not weak. He was a 79-year-old man who had spent his entire life trusting people and who encountered someone who had spent years perfecting the art of appearing trustworthy. He was not to blame for what happened to him. I am angry that it happened. I will probably always be angry that it happened. But I am also, in a way I did not expect, proud of what Nathan and I did with that anger. We did not waste it. We turned it into something that helped not just our family but other families we had never met. David, whose father Frank had been one of Marlene's earlier victims, sent me a card after the criminal case concluded. It said, "Thank you for finishing what I could not finish alone." I keep that card in my desk. I look at it when I think about George and his garden and his crossword puzzles and the evenings that were too long after Eleanor died. He deserved better. He deserved the truth about who Linda was. We could not give him that in time. But we could make sure she did not do it to someone else's father. That had to be enough. And it was. Thank you for listening to this story. New story every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. If you have an elderly parent who is alone, please check in. Not just with a phone call. Really check in. Ask questions. Pay attention to the people who are paying attention to them. The best protection against what happened to George is exactly that. Someone who is watching. I will see you in the next one. There is more I need to tell you. About what it cost us to do what we did. Nathan and I spent 9 months on this. 9 months of phone calls and meetings with Catherine Webb and correspondence with Michael Chen and conversations with David and the slow, grinding process of building a case that was solid enough to matter. During those 9 months, we were also grieving. I want to say that clearly, because I think people sometimes imagine that pursuing justice is a clean, focused activity that exists separately from everything else. It is not. It is something you do while also going to work and cooking dinner and trying to sleep and missing your father. There were weeks when I could not look at the documents without feeling physically ill. Not because of what the documents said but because of what they represented, the 8 months during which something was happening to George that I had been close enough to see and had not seen clearly enough. I told Catherine this once, that I kept returning to the question of whether I could have stopped it if I had paid more attention. Catherine was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I hear that from almost every family I work with. And I want to tell you what I tell all of them." Marlene was a professional. She had been doing this for at least 12 years. She knew exactly how to behave in front of family members. She knew how to seem appropriate, how to pace the relationship so that nothing looked alarming at any given moment. The fact that you didn't stop it is not a failure of attention. It is a testament to how skilled she was at what she did. I heard that. I am not sure I fully believed it. But I heard it. Nathan handled the process differently than I did. Nathan channeled everything into the legal work. He became, over those 9 months, almost obsessive about the documentation. He knew every date, every transfer, every discrepancy in the timeline. His anger was useful. It kept him sharp. Mine was different. Mine made me tired. Made me want to sit in my car in parking lots for longer than necessary before going inside wherever I was going. Made me think about George and Eleanor and the 51 years they had together and the 3 years he had been alone, and whether those 3 years were lonely in ways he had never told us. Probably they were. He was George. He did not tell us about the things that were hard. I think about Linda, Marlene, and what it must take to do what she did. To sit with someone evening after evening, to learn everything about them, to perform affection and interest and care with enough consistency to convince a sharp, intelligent man like George. I do not understand it. I have tried and I do not understand it. What I understand is the consequence. The families left behind. David, who spent 3 years trying to get someone to listen. Susan, who signed her name to a document that prevented her from ever speaking the full truth. Nathan and me, in Catherine Webb's office, looking at a will that turned our father's loneliness into someone else's asset. I understand that. And I understand that the thing that finally worked, the thing that stopped Marlene when individual families could not, was connection. Was finding each other. Was David's documentation meeting mine, Susan's oblique confirmation meeting Michael Chen's research, all of it combining into something that no single one of us had been able to build alone. That is the lesson I want to leave you with. If something feels wrong, if a new person in an elderly parent's life seems too attentive, too present, too informed about finances, you are not being paranoid. You are paying attention. And paying attention is the first and most important step. The rest is documentation. The rest is patience. The rest is finding other people who saw what you saw. George deserved better. Frank deserved better. Harold deserved better. All the men and women whose names I do not know, in states I have never visited, who encountered someone like Marlene and did not have a Nathan or a David or a Catherine Webb. They deserved better. The least I can do is tell you this story. So that the next family has a little more warning than we did. Thank you for listening. One more thing. 6 months after the settlement, I went back to my father's house. We were preparing to sell it, a decision Nathan and I had made together, carefully, because neither of us could live in it and leaving it empty seemed wrong. I walked through every room. George's woodworking tools were still in the garage, organized with the precision he brought to everything. His crossword puzzle books were still stacked by his chair. His garden was overgrown, no one had tended it since he had gone into the hospital the previous autumn, but the bones of it were still there, the careful structure he had built over decades visible underneath the wildness. I sat in his garden for a long time. I thought about what Nathan had said to me, near the end of the legal process, when we were both exhausted and the settlement had finally been reached. He had said, "Do you think Dad knew something was wrong with her?" I had thought about that for a moment. Then I said, "I think he knew she was being kind to him partly because she wanted something. I think he probably knew that. He was too smart not to." Nathan said, "Then why did he let it happen?" I said, "Because he was lonely." And kindness, even imperfect kindness, even kindness with an agenda, it still felt like something. After 3 years of evenings alone, it still felt like something. Nathan was quiet. Then he said, "That's the saddest part." I think he was right. That is the saddest part. Not that Marlene was calculating. Not that she had done it before. Not even that the legal system was imperfect in its response. The saddest part is that a good man, in the last year of his life, was lonely enough to let someone exploit that loneliness. And that we, who loved him, had not found a way to fill enough of that space. I do not blame myself entirely for that. I had my own life, my own family. George would not have wanted me to rearrange everything to sit with him every evening. But I think about it. I think about whether I could have called more, visited more, made more space in the ordinary weeks for the kind of presents that might have left less room for Linda. I do not know the answer. What I know is that I will not make the same mistake with anyone else I love who is aging and alone. I will call more. I will visit more. I will pay attention in the ways I did not pay enough attention before. That is George's legacy to me, in the end. Not the house. Not the settlement. Not the legal case. The reminder that the people we love who are alone are vulnerable in ways we do not always see. And that the best protection we can offer them is simply our presence. Our attention. Our willingness to be there, regularly and really, in the way that leaves less room for the people who are watching for the space we leave empty. I sold the house in the spring. A young family bought it. They have 2 small children who will run through the garden that George built and will not know anything about what happened there. That feels right. The garden should be full of life. George would have liked that. Thank you for being here for this story. If you know someone who is aging and alone, reach out to them today. Not tomorrow. Today. New story every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. I will see you in the next one.